Does natural science point to God? Under the theistic perspective, God can be defined as a transcendent, uncaused, sentient being who is external of time and space. The theistic perspective includes deism and theism, both except God. Evidence for the information in DNA includes the discovery of DNA's double helix structure, its mechanisms for transmission, and its complex information storage system. The information needs an origin. This has become known as the problem of DNA information for atheist materialists. The secular scientist Francis Crick said the following, quote, "Information means here the precise determination of sequence, either a basis in the nucleic acid or of amino acid residues in the protein." End of quote. On the internet, there is a counter-argument that DNA is not a code or program. This argument is complete nonsense. What is a program? A program is a sequence of coded instructions that can be inserted into a mechanism. Examples of programs include cooking recipes, lab protocols, and computer software, to name a few. DNA contains a set of instructions to make proteins. Therefore, DNA is a program. This is present in all science textbooks. To deny that DNA is a program is analogous to denying that the Earth is round. The secular scientist Francis Crick, who acquired the Nobel Prize for discovering the double helix structure of DNA, said the following, quote, "This nucleotide sequence is a simple code for the amino acid sequence of a particular protein." End of quote. Even Bill Gates, the founder of Microsoft, said that, quote, "DNA is like a computer program, but far, far more advanced than any software ever created." End of quote. On the internet, there is a counter-argument that DNA does not carry information and that the genetic code is not a language. This argument is complete nonsense. The scholarly consensus is that DNA carries information and that the genetic code is a language. This is present in all science textbooks. The scientists Alberts et al. Said the following, quote, "The conversion of the information in mRNA represents a translation into another language." End of quote. The scientists Mukai et al. Said the following, quote, "The genetic code is the language used by cells to translate their genomes into proteins." End of quote. On the internet, there is a counter-argument that natural selection can account for the genetic code. This argument is complete nonsense. Natural selection can determine which genetic sequence remains in the gene pool. The genetic sequence is unique for each organism. Natural selection cannot account for the genetic code, which is universal for all organisms. There is no materialistic explanation that can account for the genetic code. One materialistic explanation was the panspermia hypothesis, but that explanation turned out to be inadequate. On the internet, there is a counter-argument that evolution can account for the genetic code. This argument is complete nonsense. The genetic code precedes evolution. Therefore, it is impossible for evolution to account for the genetic code. On the internet, there is a counter-argument that the Miller-Urey experiment can explain the information in DNA. This argument is completely false. The Miller-Urey experiment happened in an artificial environment with limited scope, which is not generalizable to the conditions at the beginning of the universe. The secular scientist Michael Denton said the following, quote, "Considering the way the prebiotic soup is referred to, it comes as something of a shock to realize that there is absolutely no positive evidence for its existence." End of quote. On the internet, there is a counter-argument that the spontaneous generation theory can explain the information in DNA. The spontaneous generation theory was a materialistic theory that stated that living organic matter could emerge from non-living inorganic matter using a material cause. This argument is completely false. The spontaneous generation theory was disproven by Louis Pasteur in the 19th century using his swan neck flask experiment. The secular scientist Paul Davies said the following, quote, "The spontaneous generation of life is a ludicrously improbable event." End of quote. On the internet, there is a counter-argument that the information in DNA can emerge randomly by chance eventually. This argument is completely false. Firstly, there is not enough time, since time and resources are finite. To use an analogy, it would be like having a bunch of monkeys trying to write Shakespeare's sonnets in a submarine. Sooner or later, the oxygen will run out of the submarine, and the monkeys will die before writing the sonnets, and the monkeys will fail. It cannot happen randomly under these conditions. Secondly, the new generalized second law states that increased complexity of biological structures will never form randomly with the passage of time. Thirdly, there are limitations in the natural laws which prevent, for example, an element with 200 protons or a carbon isotope with 53 neutrons from appearing naturally by chance. In nature, chance interactions do not necessarily lead to unlimited outcomes. Another counter-argument is that nature has information ratchets. This argument is completely false. The initial information needed to make the selection always exceeds any possible gain in information. Natural information ratchets do not exist. Another argument is that the hypothetical law called the emergent law of complexity can account for the origin of information in DNA. This argument is completely false. This explanation has several problems. Firstly, it has no empirical evidence. Secondly, it violates statistical thermodynamics. Thirdly, it violates information theory. Another counterargument is about the RNA world hypothesis. This argument is a red herring in regards to the information in DNA, since this hypothesis only explains what happens after the information is present. RNA still carries information. Another counterargument is about the presence of junk DNA. This argument is a red herring in regards to the information in DNA, since it presupposes the presence of information. Junk DNA still carries information. The junk DNA argument is used against those who seek to replace the evolutionary mechanisms and not the information in DNA. Another counterargument is the argument from bad design. This argument is a red herring in regards to the information in DNA, since it only explains what happens after information is present. Mutations still carry information. The argument from bad design is used against those who use the argument from design in organs and not in information in DNA. Another counterargument is about the prebiotic natural selection. This argument is a red herring since it presupposes the presence of information. Therefore, it provides no explanatory power for the information in DNA. The secular scientist Christian de Duve said the following, quote, "Prebiotic natural selections need information which implies they have to presuppose what is to be explained." End of quote. Another counterargument is that biochemical predestination can account for the information in DNA using attraction. This argument is completely false. Differences in bonding affinity do not determine the arrangement of bases and cannot explain sequence specificity. Therefore, it cannot explain the information in DNA. Another explanation is the panspermia hypothesis, which is a materialistic explanation. The panspermia hypothesis attempts to account for the information in DNA. The panspermia hypothesis states that a non-transcendent designer, namely a space alien, seeded the origin of biological information. If panspermia is false, a program needs a programmer that is transcendent, since the information in DNA was present at the beginning of the universe. A transcendent being, in other words, namely God. If panspermia is true, a non-transcendent being, namely a space alien, seeded the origin of biological information. This space alien must consist of simpler organisms and be present at the beginning of the universe, which means the space alien needs an external cause to come into being. This external cause is, per definition, God. The scholar Antony Flew said the following, quote, "Probably Darwin himself believed that life was miraculously breathed by God." End of quote. Flew also said the following, quote, "Darwin himself pointed out that this whole argument began with a being which already possessed reproductive powers." End of quote. Scholars who became convinced of God because of the information in DNA include the following. 1. Antony Flew, who was the world's leading atheist philosopher. 2. Dean Kenyon, who was a secular scientist. He eventually became a Christian as well. He repudiated his own materialistic theory of biochemical predestination. 3. Richard Lumsden, who was a secular scientist and won the highest world award for parasitology. He eventually became a Christian as well. 4. John C. Sanford, who was a famous secular scientist and was the co-inventor of the gene gun, among other things. He eventually became a Christian as well. 5. Fazl Rana, who was a secular scientist. He eventually became a Christian as well. He is now a member of the organization called Reasons to Believe. 6. Salvador Cordova, who was an agnostic scientist and became famous after appearing on the cover of the prestigious scientific journal Nature. He eventually became a Christian in light of the historical evidence, among other reasons. Question: what are a few proposed explanations for the information in DNA? A few explanations for the information in DNA include 1. The panspermia hypothesis, 2. Spontaneous generation theory, and 3. The God hypothesis. The panspermia hypothesis turned out to be inadequate, and the spontaneous generation theory turned out to be inadequate. By process of elimination, only the God hypothesis remains. Conclusion: natural science points to God. For real. Who was the author of this presentation? The author of this presentation was S.M. Sabbag. He is a professional molecular biologist where he has experience using CRISPR-Cas9, Western blot, and indirect ELISA, to name a few procedures. His master's degree in bioscience and his bachelor's degree in bioscience are from a secular state university. He has work experience from a biorefinery, analyzing samples of using laboratory equipment. He has experience in bioinformatics, where he has analyzed next-generation sequencing data, among other things. He has experience in programming using the following languages: Perl, Python, HTML, C++, and C#, to name a few. He has experience in using statistical programs such as SPSS, Stata, and Minitab, to name a few. He has experience in forensic science, where he has analyzed DNA samples, among other things. He has experience using cartographic programs such as ArcGIS and ArcMap. He has experience in environmental law. He has experience in environmental inventories and assessments. He acquired the first prize in an innovation competition among 539 contributions from 91 countries. For several years, he was an atheist materialist and an atheist existentialist.